So we are running a little late, but I suggest we still take a few questions and then maybe start the next session 5 minutes late, because I think the second discussion session is a bit longer than the first one. So we have a little bit of slack, but it would be a pity not to take any questions. So I'll start with an online one. So this one goes to Shakir. And this one says, the question is, do you think conferences can keep registration fees low, meaning below $100, when sponsorship amount also drops to reflect a virtual event compared to a physical extravaganza, since many top venues are still barely decreasing fees compared to the high discount that we're seeing at iClear?
Hopefully you can hear me again. I think the question of the cost of conferences is actually the practical issue of also just picking up on the previous topic of how to create these kind of hybrid formats, because we have physical spaces that need to be paid for in advance, and everyone else here who sits on these boards and is actually doing the logistics, there's quite a big challenge between how it is we do that. So I'll leave aside this question of how we manage the finances of this sort of hybrid format. But I think in general, the virtual format, we can actually, even with the format that we had, pay almost entirely through the registration at the levels that we had or slightly higher. So I'll give you some example of that. We had to use a lot of Zoom calls. Zoom can actually be pretty expensive depending on the kind of licenses that you need. And you may need up to 2,000 of these kind of licenses, webinars versus others. We also have to pay for the service of the chat facility, and that also comes at the cost of our back end of support. There's also the service for the video conferencing, but all of that together could be something around $300,000, depending on how you're managing the kind of budget in the end. So, you know, if we have the right numbers of scale, we can actually do it. So there's a bit of questions for all of us on these boards of ICML board and the New York board and ICML, how we actually balance these things. But I do think it is possible. And also we have the time and opportunity now by working with all our different cousin conferences together to share a lot of infrastructure between us. And if we did that kind of shared infrastructure, then we'd also create a more consistent experience between us across the field. We can ask these kind of questions of what values we are thinking are important. We can share costs, and then we can also help manage these kind of cost issues. So I think this is sort of one of the biggest questions for all of us who are now practically dealing with it, but I'm committed to thinking about this much more in both hybrid formats and fully virtual, that we keep these costs down, particularly because when you meet the people who come, who could never have come before, that is the thing that really lifts your soul in some sense. The young kind of students who are coming from Iran, or who you've met from Sudan, or even in South Africa where I'm from, who you get to speak to, would never be able to come any other way. So I think there was really, for that reason alone, we should be committed to figuring that out.
Maybe he's speaking as one of the organizers of this workshop here. One should also say to people who have never organized a conference, organizing an online conference is actually much easier than organizing a physical conference. The entrance barrier is very low, so you should just think about whether you want to organize something. Anyway, so the next, I have one more online question that I'll ask to Neil, and maybe meanwhile, people who are here in the chat room or in the Zoom room can think about an actual a live question that I'll ask afterwards, or that they can ask afterwards. So this question goes to Neil. And the question is, are the questions that you deal with in the Delft group public? And if yes, can experts come to you to help to answer them? Or is it limited to the network of people that you already have?
They're not public, but oddly, they're not like secret either. I sort of shared some of our thinking today. It's a really great question, because one of the challenges in the whole supply chain of ideas is if you open it up too much, then managing that supply chain gets totally overloaded. But of course, we would love to bootstrap the expertise of everyone across the community. So we haven't made a public list, because I think that almost would turn into an advert where we would get a lot of interest. But if people have specific things that they're interested in contributing, really feel free to email me, and I can see how we can stitch them in. Because it's not like, I mean, the questions we're looking at are all the things you would guess. There's nothing particularly surprising.
Thank you very much, Neil. Yeah. So do we have a question here in the room? I think
maybe for me, yeah. So I have two questions, maybe, or one question to Shakir. So did you need to develop a lot of customized software to organize a conference, or was it essentially Zoom and I don't know what you used, Slack or so for chat, or did you need to integrate a lot of, well, developing a lot of new stuff, which costs a lot of money, maybe? Yeah, so maybe that's one question.
Yeah, so yeah, in addition to sort of, you can buy those licenses to each of these individual tools, they alone are not enough to create a meaningful conference experience. So actually everything else we coded ourselves, and actually mainly due to the work of two people, Sasha Rush and Hendrik Strobel, who actually wrote the code that integrated every single thing on that website. And the reason we chose certain kinds of tools was that they were easy to embed into the website. So we used a tool called Rocket Chat that was particularly easy to embed, but also we wanted to control the data ourselves and to think about questions of privacy and who has access to data and where those things are seen, and to respect the data of people. So actually we had to write a lot of custom software, particularly because we also as a community have a certain kind of cultural expectation about how we want to engage with papers, the tools we have available. So
do you consider making that software available to the communities for other conference organizers? Did you consider that?
Yeah, so all of that code that we use is already available publicly. It's an open source repository. I think Sasha and Hendrik are actually working on a slightly cleaned up version of it, what they're calling mini-conf, which you can actually do. And actually any of us on this call and on the stream, it's pretty easy for ourselves to reproduce, because in the end, if you have your data from your conference, a list of papers in a CSV file, you can write a script that just converts that to a markup file, and then you have just a thing that runs in the end, generates a set of static web pages. And then those are the web pages that everyone engages with. And that's also the reason you want to have static, at least in this case, was that it makes it very clear that it's reliable. You know, static web pages don't require scalability issues and concerns around big things, the internet collapsing. So even if you had 10,000 people, it wouldn't actually die in that sense. So yeah, all of this is available. I can point everyone to it afterwards. I'll leave a comment on the YouTube channel where people can look at it and play around with themselves. I will say there is sort of one benefit of iClear, which may be not possible in other conferences, which is part of the work we need to think about, which is scale. I think something very different needs to be done for smaller conferences, a conference that may have 100 people or less, and a different kind of mechanism for an in-between conference. And of course, the one we did works very well because we are very large, operates across the globe, has people at every time zone. But if we are just, you know, operating in Central European time, I think there are different things we can do around that. So that's sort of more where things need to happen as well.
Yeah, that's great.
So I would like to thank all speakers again, thank the audience, encourage them to sign Karl Johann's petition. And I think this was a fascinating session, very different from what we had so far, but actually I think it nicely illustrated that this is a very broad problem. It's not just about finding drugs and writing contact tracing apps. So very much, thank you very much for this broad perspective. And I will hand over to Gunnar again, who will chair the next session.